The Thing started out as an idea in the mid-1970s from David Foster and Lawrence Terman. They wanted to do a faithful adaptation of the John W. Campbell Jr. novella entitled Who Goes There, as opposed to the Howard Hawks version from 1951. Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins originally had the rights, but they passed on them, which caused Universal to snatch them up. In 1976, John Carpenter was approached to helm the film by co-producer Stuart Cohen, but since Carpenter was mainly an indie director, Universal went with Tobe Hooper instead. They were unhappy with the version that he and Kim Henkel produced, which was described as being Moby Dick but with aliens, and was set to be partially filmed underwater. In addition to many other pitches from many other writers, which included William F. Nolan and David Wiltse, as well as trying to bring on other directors, one of which included John Landis. It was because of all this confusion of what to do, it was put on hold. Eventually, when Alien was released, it revitalized the project, with Carpenter's name buzzing around due to his success of Halloween. Carpenter was unsure if he could helm such a project, as he held the original to high regard, but after reading the original story, he found it creepy and interesting. Carpenter began to develop ideas for The Thing, and hired Dean Cundey as the cinematographer as they worked together on Halloween. Carpenter almost dropped out, as he wanted to helm a passion project of his called El Diablo, and was worried that it was going to be made without him. However, it turned out to be false, and Carpenter was still on, although Walter Hill, Sam Peckinpah, and Michael Ritchie were considered to replace him. He didn't want to write the film, as in recent years he found that aspect to be very difficult, so he had someone else write it. Richard Matheson, Nigel Neal, and Derek Washburn were all considered before Bad News Bears writer Bill Lancaster was eventually chosen to write the film. He eventually wrote 4 drafts, going through several endings, one of which were both Childs and McCready became the Thing, one which the complete opposite happened, but they were worried that birds weren't affected by the Thing, and an ending that was more described as a Twilight Zone style ending. There were a lot of contenders for the casting of the film, with many famous actors, or actors who would be famous. Christopher Walken, Jeff Bridges, and Nick Nolte were all considered for McCready, along with Sam Shepard, Tom Atkins, and Jack Thompson. Other contenders for various roles were Brian Dennehy, who was strongly considered for Copper, Chris Christopherson, John Hurd, Ed Harris, Tom Berenger, Scott Glenn, and Fred Ward. Carl Weathers and Isaac Hayes were considered for Childs, with Carpenter favoring the latter. Ernie Hudson almost got the part until they found Keith David. Carpenter wanted Donald Pleasance for the role of Blair, but he was considered too famous, so a then unknown Wilford Brimley was chosen instead. For the character of Palmer, David Clennon was chosen, but comedians like Jay Leno and Gary Shandling were considered. Jerry Orbach and Lee Van Cleef were considered for Gary. The Thing eventually started filming on August 24th, 1981 in Alaska, and lasted for about 12 weeks, going from Alaska to the Universal lot to British Columbia. During production, there were many scenes that were added that were not in the script, as well as plenty of omitted scenes of people just standing around and talking. Carpenter wanted to perfect the pace so it had a perfect balance of slower scenes and action-filled scenes. He also filmed happier endings at the behest of the editor, since he thought that the ending would not sit well with audiences, one of which was a scene with Mac getting found and getting a blood test to show he wasn't the Thing. There was plenty of cutting and recutting the film to make sure it had the proper pace and tone. Surprise, surprise, test audiences didn't like the ending, which was rather close to the ending we got. And there was another ending that was used where Childs was omitted, which tested a little bit better. It was going to be used, but at the last minute, the ambiguity with Childs was liked by producers and Carpenter more, so Childs was added back in, and a scream over the explosion to push that the Thing was deader than previously thought. With plenty of problems with test audiences, the film was eventually finalized. On June 25th, 1982, John Carpenter's The Thing was finally released on that date. It received overwhelming negative reviews, calling the effects terrible and barf-inducing, the story dull and slow, and it being too nihilistic and dreary. Many critics describe the film as instant junk, wretched excess, and the quintessential moron movie of the 1980s. It certainly didn't help that Steven Spielberg's polar opposite film, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, was released just 2 weeks prior, with having a more hopeful and optimistic view of aliens. Many people also stated that it paled in comparison to the Howard Hawks original, The Thing from Another World. Even the original director, Christian Nyby, stated that Carpenter's film was terrible. It even got nominated for Worst Musical Score at the Razzies. This caused Carpenter's career to go into standstill for the time being, with Universal pulling him from directorial duties on the Stephen King adaptation, Firestarter, which went to Mark L. Lester, which then went on to also bomb and receive terrible reviews, even from King himself. He only accepted his next film, Christine, another King adaptation ironically, for the money, as he worried his career was over. Despite this, Carpenter went on to have varying degrees of success for many of his films, like Starman, Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness, They Live, and In the Mouth of Madness. On home video, the film received a second life, and many people started to appreciate it with time. Nowadays, many people call John Carpenter's The Thing one of the greatest science fiction horror films of all time, has become one of the biggest cult films ever, and has inspired, along with many of his other cult films, an entire generation of filmmakers. When I first watched the film in, I want to say, early high school, I thought it was good. I was particularly unsatisfied with the film, as the main thing that was always described as a selling point were the effects by Rob Bottin, who was only 23 at the time. When I watched it, I was disappointed that there wasn't more, and the rest of the movie was in fact rather dull in comparison. I even missed key plot points that I didn't discover until later rewatches. I think it was because the film was poorly described to me, as the only major review I had seen of the film was James Rolfe's review on it. He actually preferred the original film and described the remake as unbalanced, with the amazing effects at the forefront, with a rather dull story outside of that. I still love the man and his videos, but seeing his review first wasn't the best idea. It wasn't until I learned more about the film, watching various videos about it and seeing other opinions talking about the film, that I slowly appreciated it more and more. And then rewatch upon rewatch, it slowly just became this masterpiece of filmmaking to me. I don't know what movie everyone was watching back in 1982, but it surely could not be this. The Thing is one of those movies where it manages to balance two types of horror rather impeccably, gore and atmosphere. While many people like to talk about the effects of the film, and rightfully so, they're some of the greatest practicals ever put to film. However, that's not all that this film is about. It's all about the paranoia coming from the main cast about who the Thing could be. That's where the main horror comes from, and the aspect that everyone forgets about because the effects are the focus to many people. In all honesty, the scariest moment, at least to myself, is where there is a small group of them deciding on whether or not to kill MacReady, since they're worried that he's the Thing. When they're unsure of what to do, Windows says,
"Child, what if we're wrong about him?"
And then Child says,
"Why then we're wrong?"
It still sends chills down my spine, as well as the fact that it doesn't give you a whole lot of time to react to it, because then Window breaks and the team deals with that, and it goes on from there. The fact that Childs is willing to murder a man in cold blood over whether or not he's an imposter is absolutely horrifying to me, as well as showcasing how far gone everyone is at that point. There's also a great scene of MacReady and Copper investigating the Norwegian camp. It's brilliant because of how it takes its time. I think they spend 10 minutes at the camp. Not even, but every second feels like an hour, but in a good way. And then we get to the reveal of the ship, and it just feels like such a great payoff, yet the uneasiness you feel is still there, and not done away with a jump scare. There's also so many slow scenes of people talking with each other about the situation, but it never feels boring or stale, as well as the escalation of emotions that every character is going through and how they deal with every situation. A movie today would think that escalation means more scares, more throwing shit at the camera, more set pieces, more yelling, but that's not what this is about. It's all about the little moments, the little bits of dialogue, the smaller actions of every character that show the desperation of defeating the Thing, how they manage to do certain things that they think keep them safe. Speaking of, though, every character is distinct and memorable in this movie. They all leave such an impact on you, despite some of them not getting a ton of screen time. One of the criticisms back in 1982 that critics and audience said that they didn't like about the film was that none of the characters were properly built up before the threat hits, and you don't care about them, and unfairly compared it to Alien. I think both properly built up their characters, but in very different ways. Alien spent half of the movie building up the characters and the threat, and then when the threat hits, it goes from 0 to 100. Not saying that's a bad thing, because the way Scott executed it was amazing and flawless. But in The Thing, it was simply a different way of developing the characters. Now, we are presented the threat in the first couple of minutes, but takes its time for the cast of characters, as well as I stated before, during certain decisions and actions when the Thing is attacking or there is the threat of the attack, that we get to see who the characters are and who they really are. Like a scene before the threat is prominent where Knowles is playing music too loud, specifically Superstition by Stevie Wonder, and Bennings yells at him to keep it down as he's trying to sleep. Knowles then is about to turn it off, but then decides not to. That tells you a bit about both characters despite not doing a whole lot. Knowles being a rebel that doesn't care, and Bennings being a bit of a curmudgeon despite having some good reason to be one. But as I stated, the gore is also really well executed. Personally, I like gore, when used correctly and if there's a good reason for it. I don't like movies like Hostel or a Serbian film, where it is gore for the sake of gore and it just tries to continually outdo itself with each scene going to the next. Here, the gore is used sparingly and in a good and effective way. Like the scene where Bennings is being eaten by the Thing and duplicated. It shows a good amount of blood and some creepy-ass tentacles. Or the scene where it first transforms. It's very shocking, yes, but it still works as it shows you the ins and outs of the creature and how it tries to feed and transform. Each scene where the practicals are showcased very well, it never forces it in your face about how cool or awesome it is, like the pre-make, it just sort of is. And what it is gross, yet terrifying. It's not even an escalation of more and more gore or more and more intricate transformation sequences. Hell, I'd even say it de-escalates, opting to go for the big and probably most intricate scene first and showing the not as big scenes later, despite them being rather fantastic and still very well done. But the way Carpenter showcases it each time is so different and interesting from one another that it just adds to the creepiness of the whole film. Because you really don't know what to expect for each scene, not only with who the Thing is, but what it's truly capable of and how it can defend itself. That's really the magic of it all. Not the effects in and of themselves, but again, still amazing, but what they represent and what they could be each time when you confront it, and not just the who either. That's how the gore manages to be so effective this many years later. These many things about the Thing, when it comes to characters or scares or the themes, or the aesthetic, or the escalation of paranoia and fear, but even as a film, it looks absolutely amazing. I find that many horror films today always look the same. Just very drab and dull, with so many scenes looking the same with no flavor or spice to any of it. However, frequent John Carpenter collaborator Dean Cundey manages to find this sort of weird beauty in the terror of the situation. The use of very cool colors of the blues and purples were very entrancing to me, and many others who watched the film. I don't know why, but whenever I'm watching this film, the temperature in the room always feels colder. Like it's really reaching through my screen to send chills down my spine, by not just its terror, but by its setting as well. Even though the actual setting in and of itself is drab, Cundey manages to make it look exceptionally interesting, yet terrifying, and is fully drenched in the atmosphere of the unknown. Especially any scenes outside, as I noted before with the blues and purples. But even during the scenes inside, you still get these extraordinary and beautifully lit scenes where it's just enough to blend all these colors together perfectly, so it's not incredibly dark or incredibly overlit and washed out. It's just so perfect and beautiful to look at. I have heard the Blu-ray is exceptional and really enhances that, but I have yet to see it. Despite it being a slow burn, it's never at all boring or dull or drab. As I said before with the atmosphere, it just slowly escalates and then hits you with the scene reveal of the Thing and who or what it is. There are just so many long stretches of build-up and finger-pointing and distrust and pure paranoia. It's honestly one of the best-paced films I have ever seen. Every scene just magically falls into the next, and every scene just feels so necessary and not out of place. With so many movies from all across cinema history, but I'm more so noticing it nowadays, where there are so many cut scenes that feel so important to the overall narrative that you wonder why they cut it in the first place. Or vice versa, where they insert so many scenes that feel like filler to pad out the running time. But here, every scene serves a purpose, whether that be building up the characters before the threat really strikes, or showing the ongoing exhaustion of everyone dealing with the threat, or actually having the threat strike. Every scene is just so perfectly executed that it never feels too short or too long. This is a perfectly executed slow burn movie because you still have that sort of extravagant, effect-heavy gratification. While something like Alien never has that extreme punch to the gut when the alien is involved in a death or something like that, The Thing does have that, and I really appreciate that. Not saying that it's a bad thing, since Alien is a very different film. I just like how The Thing has this exceptional tension and pacing, but it does give you the gratification and payoff that some people might want. But even with that, the payoff doesn't undo the tension you feel because you have this ongoing threat in the back of your head that, sure, it might reveal itself now, but there still might be someone else out there lurking in the shadows as the Thing. The pacing in this movie is just one of those many perfect things about the movie because it's slow but not boring. Somehow Carpenter managed to make it slow-moving but fast-paced at the same time, but not fast-paced in a bad way. It just manages to have an effective slow build, but also manages to be paced so well that the ending arrives before you even know it. In its 109-minute running time, Carpenter managed to have an effective slow build that builds paranoia in you so well and causes so much anxiety, yet it always keeps going. It never grinds to a halt with terrible exposition or filler. It's always on a constant move pacing-wise, and it's still effective to this day. Comparatively to something like Ad Astra, where that movie is always constantly on the move, it just never feels it. That is a slow build but with no payoff, but is also moving along at a snail's pace, and you become so bored with the movie before the plot even starts to move forward. Ad Astra was definitely one of those movies that made me appreciate The Thing a hell of a lot more than I already do because of how terribly executed its pacing, story, and character development are. But we're not here to talk about that. Probably one of its greatest strengths, besides everything else, is in its writing. A lot of people back in the day, but especially nowadays, always make fun of how, in horror movies, everyone always makes really dumb decisions. While it was mainly about slasher films, that idea did sort of bleed into other horror subgenres. So much so, Geico made an entire commercial about it.
Why can't we just get in the running car?
Are you crazy?
The writing in this movie pretty much shits on the whole characters make dumb decisions stereotype. When watching, you're never asking why a character does a certain thing a certain way, or why they try to solve a problem a certain way, unless you're trying to dig up bad things about a movie to be a spoil sport. And trust me, I know many people like that. Due to the fact that every character got properly developed in their own interesting way, no decision feels 1. Contrary to the character's ideas, rationalizations, and or personality, and 2. Idiotic in any way. It always makes sense for the situation and the character. I know that it may seem like a weird thing to praise, but when you're dealing with such a poorly respected genre like horror, especially with a stereotype ingrained in people's minds, you really need to give praise to that certain thing to throw away that somewhat idiotic preconceived notion that everyone has about horror movies. The characters in The Thing are believable and rational. Based on what they know and what they're learning throughout the movie, they try to make rational decisions based on that. But since The Thing is an ever-changing organism, it constantly throws these guys for curveballs and twists they aren't suspecting, as well as the fact that the ensemble cast never feels formulaic like in a lot of other horror movies, or just regular movies in general. It doesn't fall into that trap, but it perfectly perpetuates what the film Cabin in the Woods was trying to state. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend checking out the film, or if you don't have the time, watch the video Exploring Cabin in the Woods by Good Bad Flicks. But due to the fact that every character was written, as well as cast, so goddamn perfectly, every single solitary thing done in this movie feels rational, even to the audience. While it's easy for us to point out and nitpick stupid things, here it still doesn't feel that way because every decision is even rational to us. Mainly because it comes down to the fact that we don't know who the Thing is either, so we're gathering information along with the characters. We don't automatically know everything and can yell at the characters for not understanding or doing something a certain way. The writing from Bill Lancaster is just so goddamn tight that it would take a lot of digging to really find something wrong with it. Everything from beginning to end is so brilliantly constructed. One of the last things I want to mention is the score from Ennio Morricone, which is also brilliant. While I don't think it's the best non-Carpenter score from a Carpenter film, that honor to me goes to Jack Nitzsche's score from Starman. It's just so amazing because of how simple it is. Carpenter stated that he doesn't like to overburden the audience with music and only likes to use it as wallpaper. I feel like this film is the shining example of it. The main theme, which is I think 1 out of 2 songs used in the film, is very simply an irregular heartbeat. It starts off as almost a regular heartbeat, but then a second irregular beat then comes in, showcasing that the thing will never truly be human, will never truly be the most perfect imitation. Then the melody is brought in later on, and it's sort of this simple drone that is repeated over and over again that sort of lulls you into a sort of complacency that you begin to not question the irregular heartbeat. It really is brilliant. Then the other track that was actually used in the film is when a sign of paranoia or distrust is happening on screen and has these incredibly high strings that really irks you and subtly says to you that, remember, something will never be right in this situation. It really fills you with anxiety and unrest and is just brilliantly composed by Morricone. Despite the fact that these 2 tracks are genuinely great, the rest of the score wasn't really used all that much. I do recommend seeking the rest of the score out as it is on YouTube, as well as being repurposed in the Quentin Tarantino film The Hateful Eight, where it is also extremely effective and used very well there. With the ever-growing popularity of The Thing, it managed to get launched into a major media franchise. In 1991, it received a comic book sequel entitled The Thing from Another World, basing it off of the original's title due to the possible copyright of the Marvel superhero The Thing. It takes place 24 hours after the original film and shows what happens to MacReady and Childs. It then received 2 sequel miniseries, The Thing from Another World, Climate of Fear, and The Thing from Another World, Eternal Vows. All received mixed reviews stating that they were decent continuations of the story, but were heavily criticized that the mechanics of how the thing worked were inconsistent with the 1982 film. There was then another comic book miniseries, this time yet another sequel to the original film, and disregarded the 3 miniseries before it, and doesn't include a conclusion onto what happens to MacReady and Childs. There was a planned sci-fi miniseries in 2005 that was going to be produced by Frank Darabont and written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick, co-writer of Aquaman, entitled Return of the Thing. It would have initially continued 6 months after the original film left off, with Russians finding Outpost 31 destroyed, as well as the frozen bodies of MacReady, Childs, and the Thing, as well as taking parts of the destroyed spacecraft. They tried to experiment on it, but it involved someone getting killed, so they decided not to pursue it. The rest of it takes place in 2005, and it involves rebels taking over the lab where it was located, them taking a vial of what they assume to be smallpox, and someone gets imitated. They board an airliner where the imitation suffers a heart attack, and the aircraft crash lands in an isolated part of New Mexico. And the rest of the miniseries would take place from there, where it's assumed it would be dealing with the survivors' encounters with the Thing. It never took shape with Universal wanting to make a film sequel, which morphed into the 2011 film The Thing, a prequel to the 1982 film's events. This ends up tarnishing Carpenter's film, as the writers and director really ended up not understanding what made the original so great in the first place, and it ended up being not as great and was more of a remake than a prequel. But now it's getting another remake, this time by Blumhouse, which would incorporate elements from the original 1951 film, the 1982 film, and the novel version of the original story, Who Goes There, entitled Frozen Hell. The Thing also got a sequel video game following a couple months after the original film, which received good reviews and apparently had some involvement from Carpenter, but I have found no evidence of this. The Thing has even received a card game and a board game, the latter of which I've played, and it's really fun. It's also worth noting that some people consider the English-Spanish co-production Horror Express with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee to be a loose adaptation of the original short story. Before I conclude my thoughts about The Thing, I wanted to talk about the original, The Thing from Another World. With everyone's ever-growing love of John Carpenter's The Thing, even myself, everyone somewhat forgets about the original Howard Hawks version. Technically, it was directed by Christian Nyby, but as I stated before, it's more so known as the Hawks version, as he was very hands-on. I have watched the original film, and I will say, it's a good film. I'll keep my thoughts short, as this is more so about the 1982 film, but it's good. The monster in the film looks very good, despite sort of being that lumbering Frankenstein-esque monster, as well as playing with some audience expectations. What I mean by that is how back in the day you had to show a character going from one room to another through that door because they thought people would be confused otherwise. I know. Ridiculous. With that, there is a scene where a group of characters go from one room to another, and unexpectedly the monster is waiting on the other side of the door, ready to attack. I thought this was an intriguing way of subverting that idea. The music is fantastic. I absolutely love when the theremin is used in old school 1950s B-movies. I also appreciate how you feel the cold setting, similar to the 1982 film. The bits of comedy also feel, I wouldn't say timeless, but it was fine, and some jokes did get a chuckle out of me. Plus, the final lines of the film are very chilling.
Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
And the scene with the monster on fire is a great practical effect. But outside of those few things, the movie pretty much falls flat for me personally. It's a run-of-the-mill B-movie. It's not a higher-class film like The Fly, although that film isn't all that great either, nor is it so bad it's good like Plan 9 from Outer Space. It kind of gets caught in the mix of all the other movies that were coming out at the time. The atmosphere isn't really there, none of the characters are exceptionally interesting. It does follow a lot of the tropes of the time, and I feel there's not a lot there. It totes more realistic dialogue, but when I'm not into the rest of the movie, realistic dialogue doesn't really matter to me in the long run. However, as an ever-growing cinephile, I feel as though it's important to talk about film history when the original film, despite my thoughts, as John Carpenter's masterpiece did unfortunately overshadow the original when it didn't deserve it, especially for many years when it was considered the better film. It's known as one of the very first alien invader movies in a time where the paranoia of alien invaders was incredibly high after the Roswell incident in 1947. It unfortunately couldn't do the original novel justice, as we've seen with the Carpenter version. It was supposed to be an alien imitating humans, and that couldn't be shown very well in 1951. So, as I said, it was changed to a lumbering Frankenstein-esque monster that could regrow limbs and was described as a vegetable monster. Despite it being overshadowed by the remake/reimagining, it's still considered by many old-school fans to be the quintessential alien invader movie. It might not be one of the greatest movies ever, but its importance and stamp on cinematic history should still very much be noted, as the ever-growing love of the Carpenter version almost erased this from existence. If you do want to learn more about it, I do recommend James Rolfe's video about it entitled The Thing is Underrated. As he does prefer the original film, I think it's important to hear both sides in terms of the original film. However, it does irk me that he somewhat bad-talks the Carpenter film to put the original on a pedestal. The Thing from Another World is an incredibly important film that should not be erased. I recommend watching them back-to-back to get an open mind about both. I probably should have done that way back when, but I was young and didn't fully understand how deep I would go into my love of horror and of The Thing. Despite my history with it, it's still necessary that you watch both to come to your own opinions about them. Just not the pre-make. That just sucks. Despite the original reviews of The Thing, it still manages to impress audiences this many years later. Even though it does somewhat erase the ever-important original, it's still a shining example of an underdog film. It was one of the most hated films of the 1980s for many years because I, as well as many other people, think it was ahead of its time. It proved to be too shocking for audience back then, that they were too scared to fully appreciate Carpenter's mastery of instilling paranoia into his audience. Despite every single rewatch, you find something new and interesting about it, as well as scenes you never noticed that feeds into key plot points about the film that you discover later on. Many critics just had a blanket statement about the effects that they really didn't notice the idiosyncrasies and many things that made it as great as it was. I do hope that Carpenter appreciates the fact that his film is finally getting the love and recognition it deserves. For many years, I've always thought that no film could ever be perfect, that there will always be something to find wrong. But I'm beginning to think I wasn't correct in that assessment. I think there is, and it is John Carpenter's The Thing. From the tone to the atmosphere, to its cinematography and use of colors, to the impeccable character development, to the writing, to the wonderful yet simplistic music, The Thing manages to, what I think, be absolute cinematic perfection.